So I was having coffee the other day with an old friend.
Okay.
You know, one of those guys who really, really prides himself on being like super logical.
Oh, I know the type.
Yeah.
Rational to a fault sometimes.
Exactly. And we're having this, I don't know, perfectly normal disagreement, nothing major. And suddenly he just leans back, crosses his arms, you know the pose.
The classic defensive posture. Yep.
And he hits me with, "You're getting emotional. It's typical." Just like that. Said it so calmly, too.
Wow. Like he's just observing the weather.
Right. As if he's completely detached. This is a man who genuinely believes he processes the world through pure reason.
Yeah.
Measured, rational, steady, doesn't do feeling.
The myth of the purely rational man. It's powerful.
But here's what got interesting. I didn't actually get upset. I just calmly pointed out where his argument didn't quite add up. You know, a moment where he'd been a bit unfair.
Turning the logic back on.
And then the change was immediate, like instant. The rational, measured guy, gone.
Yeah.
His face tightened up, his voice got sharp. He started deflecting straight away, telling me I was being too sensitive or overreacting.
The classic counterattack. Accuse the other person of the very thing you're doing.
Exactly. And I'm just watching this self-proclaimed logical man get visibly angry, like genuinely pissed off. Purely because he was being asked to look in the mirror, basically, to consider his own inconsistency.
Accountability is often the trigger.
And then he just throws his hands up, totally frustrated, and that's when he said it, almost like he was the victim here. He goes, "Fine, teach me then."
Wow. That anecdote, honestly, it just perfectly captures the core tension we really need to unpack today.
Right, it felt so loaded.
It really is. It's the perfect illustration of how so many people, and yeah, particularly men, tend to use this idea of pure reason as a kind of social shield.
The shield against
vulnerability,
that.
against messiness. They cling to this idea that logic and emotion are completely separate, mutually exclusive things, a neat little binary.
But it's not that neat in reality.
Not at all. That whole defense just collapses instantly the moment, personal accountability or some genuine self-reflection is actually required.
Like in my friend's case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They use stoicism, or what they think is stoicism, to deny their own inner lives. And then when that denial gets exposed, even gently, the default reaction is immediately anger, defensiveness, which is ironically just pure, unregulated emotion.
Yeah, the irony wasn't lost on me. And that demand, "Teach me then," it felt, I don't know, revealing?
Yeah, absolutely revealing.
Yeah.
Because it's framed like this earnest request for knowledge, right? Like, oh, I want to learn this skill.
Yeah, just give me the instruction manual.
But the motivation underneath, as you felt, it's often this desperate evasion of self-ownership. It's a subtle way of saying, look, if I'm not functioning properly, emotionally speaking, it must be because someone else failed. Someone failed to install the right emotional software in me.
Or failed to teach me the rules of this emotion game. It puts the responsibility elsewhere.
Precisely. And that's exactly why this deep dive feels so necessary. We need to dismantle that false binary thinking. Our mission today really is to investigate the psychological mechanisms behind this.
Okay.
The relational burden it creates, which is huge, and also the systemic failures that happen when vulnerable emotions, or the very things that connect us as humans, are willfully suppressed, pushed down, all under this guise of rationality.
There's a real cost to this, isn't there? Personally and more broadly.
A huge cost. We're looking at damage to relationships, stunted personal growth, and even failures in leadership and organizations. It ripples outwards.
So we've got three main areas we want to explore today to sort of connect these dots.
That's right. We'll start with the psychological root. There's this concept sometimes called normative male alexithymia, which is basically about widespread socialized emotional suppression.
Okay, the individual level first.
Yep. Then we'll pivot to the relational cost. We can look at that through the lens of what's sometimes called gendered emotional labor, or maybe more specifically, relational management.
Right, how this impacts partnerships.
Exactly. And then finally, we'll zoom out to the systemic level. We want to see how this individual emotional denial translates, often directly, into pretty catastrophic avoidance in leadership and failures within organizations.
So it's not just a personal problem. It has real-world consequences in the workplace, too.
Absolutely. The core message for you listening is that emotional health, emotional awareness, it isn't some soft skill. It's not optional. It's actually a foundational requirement for competence, both in life and, crucially, in leadership.
Okay, let's start then with that foundational concept you mentioned, alexithymia. Where does that word even come from? What does it actually mean?
Sure. So The term itself, alexithymia, it's Greek.
Yeah.
Literally, it translates to something like without words for emotions, alexithymosin.
No words for feelings.
Exactly. It was first noticed decades ago in clinical settings with patients who really struggled to talk about their inner world. But the concept has proven really crucial for understanding non-clinical populations too, ever since.
So it's more than just being like quiet or reserved.
Oh, much more. It's not just reluctance to talk. It's understood now as a distinct personality construct. It involves a whole cluster of cognitive and affective processing deficits. Basically, difficulties in how someone processes emotions internally.
Okay, so this is deeper than just being uncomfortable talking about feelings at, say, a dinner party. It's a genuine internal difficulty in actually processing emotional information.
That's right. The research points to maybe 4 core deficits that really define the experience for someone high in alexithymia.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, there's the most obvious one. Difficulty identifying feelings and then describing those feelings to others or even to themselves. They might feel, bad or off, but they can't easily label it. Is it shame, disappointment, fear, anger, just a general state of discomfort?
Like an undifferentiated negative feeling.
Precisely. Second, and this is really crucial, they often have difficulty distinguishing between those feelings and purely bodily sensations.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they might confuse the physical symptoms of anxiety, like a racing heart or tense muscles, with just being physically ill or maybe hungry. Or they might misinterpret a feeling of vulnerability or need for closeness as a need to exert physical control or just general restlessness.
Wow. So they mistake an internal emotional state for a physical problem that needs fixing.
That sounds incredibly confusing for the person actually experiencing it. It is. It leads to a lot of misinterpretations of their own internal signals. The third deficit is often described as a paucity of fantasies or internal life, a kind of restricted imagination and maybe a lack of engagement in introspection. Less daydreaming, less thinking about what if.
More focus on the concrete here and now.
Exactly. Which ties into the fourth deficit, a strong tendency toward what's called externally oriented thinking. They process the world primarily through observable facts, external events, concrete details, actions, rather than subjective internal experiences, feelings, intuitions.
If you can't measure it, fix it, or describe it factually, it might as well not exist for them.
That's often the functional reality, yes. It's a very concrete, operational way of engaging with the world.
And this sounds like the perfect internal mechanism for the person in my opening story, the friend, insisting on pure reason. He's processing everything externally because he's basically trained himself or been trained to ignore the internal signals.
And that is precisely where the socialization element becomes so important. This takes us beyond purely clinical alexithymia to a related but distinct concept, normative male alexithymia, or NMA. This hypothesis was put forward by researcher Ronald Levant.
Okay.
Levant argued that what we often see isn't necessarily a deep-seated clinical issue, but rather a widespread socialized pattern of restrictive emotionality. It's heavily influenced by traditional masculinity ideology, the rules about what it means to be a man.
So it's learned behavior for many, not necessarily innate.
Correct. While some individuals might have, say, a genetic predisposition or trauma history leading to clinical alexithymia, NMA suggests that for many, many men, this emotional deficit is largely learned. It extends well beyond clinical groups into perfectly functional, non-clinical men in society.
So society effectively hands out an instruction manual for manhood, and that manual dictates which feelings are acceptable and which are not.
That's a great way to put it. The research is actually very clear about the specific gendered emotional standards that get imposed, particularly on boys as they grow up.
What kind of standards are we talking about?
Well, there's a clear pattern. The emotions that are specifically discouraged, often quite strongly, are those that reflect vulnerability and attachment.
Like what?
Things like showing hurt, expressing sadness, admitting fear, showing fondness or deep caring, or, crucially, expressing the need for someone else. Connection needs.
Needs that might be seen as weak.
Exactly. Many boys grew up being actively instructed, boys don't cry, toughen up, don't be a sissy, or even punished, sometimes mildly, sometimes, unfortunately, quite severely, for expressing these softer emotions.
And if those are the very emotions that facilitate deep connection and intimacy, discouraging them is effectively cutting off the pathways to real closeness.
It absolutely is. It shapes relational patterns profoundly. Conversely, think about the emotions that were often actively encouraged or at least permitted in boys and men.
Aggression, competition.
Yes. Aggressive emotions like anger, competitiveness, pride. Those are often framed as acceptable, even desirable masculine traits. And often lustful or purely sexual feelings were also more permissible than, say, feelings of tender attachment.
So the resulting deficit is highly specific. It's not that men can't feel anything.
Not at all. A man operating under this NMA script might have absolutely zero trouble accessing or expressing, say, calibrated anger in a negotiation, or excitement about a win, or sexual desire, but sadness, fear, the simple admission of needing connection or support, that might be functionally unavailable to him, locked away.
Which brings us back to the ultimate cost of this sort of mandated stoicism. We see it so clearly in that anecdote you mentioned about the successful engineer.
Ah, yes, the story of the engineer whose wife eventually left him, telling him she had been lonely for 40 years. It's just heartbreaking.
40 years.
Because it perfectly highlights the tragedy of that externally oriented thinking we just discussed. This man, by all external measures, was highly successful. He was likely a superb logistical problem solver in his career.
Good at fixing things.
Exactly. And that's how he approached his wife's emotions. Her sadness wasn't an experience to be shared or explored with empathy or simply sat with. To him, it was like a leaky roof, a functional problem that required a quick, logical fix.
So he'd offer solutions or try to cheer her up.
Precisely. He'd offer solutions, maybe throw money at the problem, suggest distractions, anything but actually be present with her sadness, share vulnerability, or acknowledge the emotional reality without trying to immediately extinguish it.
He built that emotional fortress around himself, maybe believing that stoicism equaled control or strength.
Yes, absolutely. He likely spent decades reinforcing that wall. He was probably proud of his ability to be the steady rock, the provider, the one who never wavered emotionally. It's a role many men feel pressured into.
But the fortress worked too well.
It did exactly what a fortress does. It isolated him. He ended up trapped inside his own successful prison, completely unable to access the very intimacy and connection he probably thought he was providing for his family through his stoicism. The suppression, that relentless denial of his own and her inner life, was the ultimate cost. It cost him his most important relationship because he confused emotional denial with strength.
So let's talk a bit more about the mechanism behind building that wall. How does this emotional shutdown actually happen inside? Is it always a conscious choice, like, I'm not going to feel this, or does the brain eventually just forget how to feel certain things? That seems like the difference between suppression and repression, right?
That distinction is absolutely vital for understanding normative male alexithymia. You're right, suppression and repression are different psychological defense mechanisms.
How so?
Well, repression is generally understood as an unconscious defense. It's where painful or unacceptable thoughts, memories, or feelings are pushed out of conscious awareness entirely. You might genuinely forget that a traumatic event happened, or be completely unaware of certain deep-seated feelings. It's often reality distorting and usually stems from more severe experiences, like trauma.
Okay, so that's unconscious forgetting. What's suppression?
Suppression, on the other hand, is considered a more conscious, higher-level defense mechanism. It's more like a choice, or at least a habit, that you actively engage in. It's thinking or feeling implicitly something like, okay, I feel hurt right now, but I am choosing not to acknowledge it, not to express it, and definitely not to process it. You're aware of the feeling on some level, but you consciously push it aside or ignore it.
So when Levant proposed the NMA hypothesis, did he suggest which mechanism was more dominant? Does it depend on how intense the training was?
Exactly. He proposed a kind of continuum. The idea is that the severity of the NMA and the likely defense mechanism used might depend on the nature of the socialization. So really severe punishment for emotional expression in childhood might lead closer to true, deep repression.
Because it's too painful to even acknowledge.
Right. But for many men who experienced milder forms of socialization, like simple instruction, don't cry, man up, or maybe mild disapproval, the resulting pattern is more likely to be suppression.
A conscious, or at least semi-conscious habit of pushing feelings down.
Correct. And crucially, for the average functioning non-clinical man, the kind NMA primarily describes the research strongly suggests that the emotional deficit is largely driven by this habituated choice. It's predominantly a suppression mechanism.
Is there specific evidence for that?
Yes. There was a key study, let's call it Study 1, which used psychometric analysis, basically, questionnaires measuring personality traits on a group of college men. They measured alexithymia, NMA, and also the use of different defense mechanisms like suppression and repression.
And what did they find?
They found that suppression was the strongest unique predictor of both general alexithymia scores and scores on the normative male alexithymia scale. more so than repression or other factors.
So these men are actually quite proficient at consciously vetoing their own emotional data stream.
That's what the evidence suggests. They choose not to feel, or perhaps more accurately, they choose not to attend to or acknowledge certain feelings. It becomes a deeply ingrained habit, often starting early, but it retains that element of conscious or at least pre-conscious control, until, of course, that skill fails them, often spectacularly under pressure.
That makes the denial seem much more active, doesn't it? It's not necessarily that they're broken or incapable. They're actively choosing, moment by moment sometimes, to wear this emotional armor.
It frames it less as a passive deficit and more as an active, albeit often maladaptive, strategy.
And you mentioned there's also experimental evidence showing that this emotional block is quite specific. It targets those socially discouraged emotions, not just any feeling.
Yes, this is where the research gets incredibly sharp and quite convincing, I think. A second study, let's call it study 2, used a really powerful experimental technique called semantic priming.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, in these experiments, you're typically shown a word on a screen very quickly. That's the prime word. It flashes up and disappears. Then immediately after, another word appears, the target word. Your job is just to decide as quickly as possible if that second word, the target, is a real word or a made-up non-word, like is table a word? Yes. Is telob a word? No.
Simple enough task. But how does the first word, the prime, affect things?
The prime word, even though you might not consciously register it fully, subtly influences how quickly and accurately you process the target word. If the prime and target are related in meaning, like doctor followed by nurse, you tend to respond faster. If they're unrelated, like bread followed by nurse, you're a bit slower. It measures unconscious associations.
Okay, so how did they use this to study NMA?
They were clever. They compared how men scoring high on alexithymia processed two very distinct categories of emotion words used as primes.
What were the categories?
They used what they called experimental emotion words. These were words expressing vulnerability or attachment. Things like anguished, tender, needing, love, caring.
The kinds of emotions NMA discourages.
Precisely. And they compared the effect of these primes to the effect of control emotion words, these expressed aggression or lust. Words like angry, hostile, lewd, furious.
Emotions that are often considered more acceptable under the traditional male code.
Exactly. So the question was, would the alexithymic men show a different processing pattern specifically for the vulnerability attachment words compared to the aggression lust words?
And what did they find? Did the men scoring high on alexithymia struggle more with the vulnerable words?
It's exactly what they found. They showed significantly more errors, meaning lower accuracy on the lexical decision task, specifically when the prime words were those vulnerable attachment words.
More errors just for those words.
Just for those words. Crucially, they showed absolutely no difference in accuracy or reaction speed compared to control groups when the prime words were from the aggression list category.
Wow. That's the smoking gun, isn't it?
It really feels like it. The processing deficit isn't generalized. It's not that they're bad at processing all emotion words. It seems perfectly targeted, specifically interfering with the processing of those emotions society told them were unacceptable or unmanly. They literally seem to process anger and aggression just fine, cognitively speaking, but their internal operating system glitches or slows down when presented with concepts like need or tenderness or anguish.
That is profound. It really reinforces the idea that NMA isn't some universal natural defect, but rather a specific cognitive blind spot created by social instruction.
Yes. It suggests the rules have been internalized to the point where they interfere with basic cognitive processing of specific emotional concepts.
Now, you also mentioned something about the timing of this inhibition. That gives us clues about whether it's happening automatically or more consciously.
Right, this adds another layer. We can get clues about the timing of cognitive processes using something called stimulus onset asynchrony, or SOA. That's just the time delay between when the prime word appears and when the target word appears.
Okay, different timings test different stages of processing.
Exactly. Very short SOAs, say around 100 milliseconds, tend to tap into more automatic unconscious priming effects. Longer SOAs, like 500 milliseconds or more, allow for more conscious, strategic, or controlled processing to occur.
So what timing did they find the interference effect at for the alexithymic men and the vulnerability words?
They found significant negative priming, meaning a slower reaction time, indicating cognitive interference or inhibition, only occurred for the alexithymic men at the longer 500 millisecond SOA. There was no significant effect at the shorter, more automatic SOA.
Wait, 500 milliseconds, that's half a second. Why is that specific timing so important here?
Because, as you hinted, it tells us about the level of processing involved when the inhibition kicks in. Cognitive science has pretty well mapped the brain's general timeline for processing information and making decisions. If the interference, the blocking effect, had happened way down at 100 milliseconds, we might argue it was a truly automatic preconscious filter, maybe closer to genuine repression.
But it happened much later.
Exactly. 500 milliseconds is firmly in the domain of conscious cognitive processing. This strongly suggests that the vulnerable word was registered by the brain, its meaning was likely accessed, and then, at a later, more controlled stage of processing, the person's brain effectively executed a VGO, a defensive shutdown, an inhibition.
So it's less like a broken wire preventing the signal from arriving and more like an active choice or a deeply ingrained habit operating at a conscious level to close the door after the signal of vulnerability has already knocked.
That's a fantastic analogy, yes. They've practiced this skill of not going there so well that it becomes near instantaneous, but the timing data suggests it's happening at a level where conscious control is possible.
Which reinforces the suppression idea again.
Precisely. It really strengthens the argument that for many men exhibiting NMA, this is a willed or at least highly habituated defense, a sophisticated, often quite functional in the short-term conscious suppression mechanism. The man isn't necessarily failing to feel on some basic level. He's just become incredibly skilled at choosing not to engage with, acknowledge, or process what he feels, especially when it comes to vulnerability.
But, as we saw with the engineer example, this armor, this skill, it eventually blocks essential internal communication. It turns them into potentially emotionally stunted individuals who really struggle to connect authentically.
Exactly. And that leads us directly into the next part of the puzzle, the relational crisis that happens when you consistently outsource your own suppressed emotional life.
Because if you can't or won't process your own vulnerability, you inherently require someone else to do that heavy lifting for you.
That's often what happens. But before we dive into that, maybe we should quickly clarify some terms, because emotional work and emotional labor get used a lot, sometimes interchangeably.
Good idea. Let's define them.
Okay, so the classic definition comes from the sociologist Arlie Hochschild. She defined emotion work as the unpaid effort we all do in our private lives to change, evoke, or suppress our own emotions to align them with social rules or personal goals.
Like trying to pump yourself up before a big presentation when you're nervous,
Right.
or talking yourself out of feeling jealous.
Exactly. It's managing your own feelings in your personal life. Then Hochschild defined emotional labor as that same kind of emotion management, but performed for a wage as part of a job.
Ah, so this is the flight attendant who has to smile through turbulence or dealing with a rude passenger. Or the customer service rep maintaining that relentlessly cheerful tone.
Right. It's required by the employer, often disproportionately affects women in service industries, and it can be incredibly draining because it involves suppressing your authentic feelings for pay.
Okay, so emotion work is private, emotional labor is paid. Where does the relationship dynamic fit in?
This is where a third related concept comes in, which is equally unpaid, but operates specifically within relationships, often heterosexual ones. It's been termed relational management by researcher Alicia M. Walker.
Relational management. Okay, what does that entail?
It refers to the often invisible but incredibly draining work that women frequently do in heterosexual relationships, managing their male partners' emotional lives, especially when those partners operate under that NMA pattern we've been discussing.
So this is like the unspoken job description that gets added to the marriage contract, but maybe only one person realizes it's there?
That's a very good way to think about it, and it's exhaustive work. It involves constantly checking in on their partner's mood, trying to soothe them after a bad day, anticipating their emotional needs before they're even articulated, providing near-constant validation, acting as a buffer, or creating space for them to decompress.
Wow, that sounds like a full-time job in itself.
It can feel like one. And this labor tends to fall unevenly, largely because of those gendered socialization patterns we talked about. Women are often heavily socialized from childhood to be the emotional caretakers, the keepers of connection, the relationship managers.
While men are told to toughen up, suppress those needs.
Exactly. So men, especially those adhering to the NMA script, often lack the developed tools or even the awareness to process their own feelings independently. This creates an emotional capacity gap, often generated or at least exacerbated by traditional gender roles. The woman steps in, or feels she has to step in, to fill that gap.
Why do men who might be perfectly capable and successful in other areas of life often fail to recognize this constant relational management as actual demanding work?
Well, partly because of the very structure of NMA and the traditional male code. If a man has been fundamentally taught that his own emotional needs, especially for vulnerability or comfort, are somehow feminine or weak, he might unconsciously expect those needs to be managed externally, often by a female partner, without any effort required on his part.
He sees it as just part of what women do.
Often, yes. He might see his partner's care, her foresight, her soothing, not as a specialized, high-skilled, demanding form of labor, but as a natural, almost instinctive sign of love or care, a default feature of femininity.
Like it's just her personality.
Right. And recognizing it explicitly as work would be difficult because it would force him to acknowledge his own deficit in that area and perhaps the unfair burden he's placing on her. It's easier to see it as just how she is.
This leads directly to that unfair expectation you mentioned earlier. The man essentially expects his partner to be a mind reader.
Exactly that. He often expects her to notice his stress, his needs, his unspoken feelings, without him having to go through the vulnerable process of actually communicating them. If she really loved me, she'd know.
And that dynamic must deeply stunt his own emotional growth, right?
Profoundly. He never really has to develop deep self-awareness or learn to self-soothe or regulate his own difficult emotions, because she's always there, managing the emotional buffer zone around him. He effectively places the responsibility for maintaining his own emotional equilibrium, even his own self-worth sometimes, into someone else's hands. This creates a kind of pathological dependence, even if it looks like independence on the surface.
And then you see the potentially devastating consequences when that woman, maybe because she's burned out or just trying to reclaim some energy for herself, starts to withdraw that labor.
Yes. If the woman pulls back, maybe she stops proactively asking about his bad day, or stops trying to de-escalate his frustration for him, or simply focuses on her own needs for a change.
What happens?
The man, lacking those well-developed internal tools to self-soothe or process his own stuff, often interprets her withdrawal not as an act of self-preservation on her part, but as apathy, rejection, a sign she doesn't care anymore.
Because he's outsourced his emotional regulation to her.
Exactly. Her withdrawal leaves him feeling unseen, invalidated, maybe even panicked or abandoned. This is why some sources suggest that men caught in this pattern, when faced with their partner withdrawing this relational management, may then desperately seek that validation and emotional support elsewhere, potentially leading to affairs, for instance. They're searching for someone else willing to take on that unpaid emotional management role.
Okay, this paints a picture that sounds incredibly one-sided, and we really have to acknowledge the strong counter-perspective here. This whole conversation around emotional labor is, fiercely debated online and elsewhere. Many men feel that they are the ones carrying a tremendous, unrecognized emotional burden.
We absolutely must address that. It's a critical piece of the puzzle, and the narrative often does ignore the massive, often asymmetrical emotional weight placed upon men by their prescribed gender role, particularly the role of being this strong, stoic rock.
The provider, the protector.
Exactly. They're often expected to be the impenetrable pillar of stability for their family, for their partner, absorbing shocks, showing no fear, never buckling under pressure. That is a tremendous emotional burden to carry day in, day out.
And many argue they're forced to perform this kind of emotional repression for, say, 8 to 10 hours a day at work, regardless of how they actually feel inside, because they bear the primary material pressure to show up, perform, and provide financially. Their stoicism, in this view, isn't some lazy choice. It's a product of economic and maybe even existential necessity. They feel they're sacrificing their own emotional life and well-being for the family's stability.
And this creates a really severe double bind for many men. On the one hand, they're expected to repress their own vulnerability, their fear, their sadness, to maintain that rock image. But on the other hand, they might simultaneously be expected to be infinitely patient, deeply understanding, and emotionally fluent when their female partners express their negative emotions, often with very little room for error or pushback allowed for the man.
Right. If the man dares to express his own real vulnerability, his own struggles, what happens then? The sources suggest the consequences can be pretty harsh.
They often can be, unfortunately. He risks being ridiculed, maybe subtly, maybe overtly. He might be rejected, seen as weak or unattractive. Or perhaps worst of all, his expressed vulnerability might later be weaponized against him in arguments used as evidence of his inadequacy.
That's the fear of getting slapped with the wuss label, right? Or hearing something like, I need you to be strong right now. There's a sentiment sometimes expressed, perhaps cynically, that says, you might say you want a sensitive man, but what you actually want is a man who is sensitive to you, but fundamentally unvulnerable in his own right.
It's a tragic paradox, really. driven by these deeply ingrained, often contradictory, and frankly outdated expectations about gender roles and emotions. And this whole messy, high-stakes dynamic is exactly what leads us back full circle to your opening anecdote, to the emotional friction that erupts when the logic fails, and the inevitable return to what we might call the frustration of the perpetual student.
Yeah. When a man's logical defenses, his carefully constructed pure reason, are successfully challenged, maybe when he's held accountable for an inconsistency or unfairness, the first line of defense is often dismissal, right?
Absolutely. You're being too sensitive, you're overreacting, you're taking this too personally. He attempts to reframe the entire interaction, shifting the focus onto the other person's supposed emotional irrationality, painting it as a flaw in them, not a valid response to his behavior.
But if that dismissal fails, if the other person holds their ground,
then the defense often breaks down into that angry, frustrated defensive demand we heard in your story. Fine, teach me then.
and treating emotional intelligence like it's just arithmetic, like it's some technical skill you can just demand to be taught on the spot.
It functions as the ultimate evasion of accountability. It completely absolves the self of the lifelong, messy, difficult internal work of self-reflection, self-awareness, and emotional regulation. It turns it into an external knowledge deficit that someone else is responsible for fixing.
And what's so crucial here and so ironic is that the anger and the defensiveness he shows in that moment when he's being held accountable, that is pure emotion. It's often the most volatile kind of emotion, yet it frequently gets framed, maybe even by him, as a rational response to being unfairly attacked or wrongly accused.
That's the core tragedy, isn't it? By implicitly or explicitly defining vulnerability, sadness, fear, and the need for connection as feminine or weak, men operating under this code effectively excuse themselves from the difficult work of regulating those very emotions within themselves. They can then justify their own emotional recklessness, their volatility, their anger, even sometimes their cruelty, under the guise of intellectual superiority, or just being logical or responding rationally to provocation.
While simultaneously often holding women to an impossible, contradictory standard of perfect emotional control and constant emotional management of others.
Exactly. The double standard is immense. And this ingrained pattern of denial and accountability avoidance doesn't just damage personal relationships. It metastasizes. It scales up and causes significant problems in organizational settings, particularly in leadership.
Okay, let's shift our focus there to the professional world. When that individual tendency we've been discussing, the denial of emotion, the avoidance of discomfort, the evasion of accountability reaches the top levels of a company, what happens? Avoidance stops being just a personal quirk, right? It becomes a massive systemic liability.
Absolutely. It's no longer just about one person's internal struggles. In a leadership role, avoidance, whether it's dodging conflict, avoiding giving difficult but necessary feedback, sidestepping tough decisions, or ignoring data that contradicts a preferred narrative, it quietly but surely stalls organizational progress. It completely erodes trust. It is fundamentally the antithesis of effective leadership.
Because leaders are essentially paid to confront reality, aren't they? And avoidance is, well, it's a willful detachment from reality.
Precisely. And we can see the real-world cost of this kind of leadership avoidance in plenty of high-profile corporate examples. Think about, say, the friction that emerged over the years between Unilever and its subsidiary, Ben & Jerry's.
Right. The ice cream brand known for its very vocal social activism.
Exactly. For years, it seems, leadership at the parent company, Unilever, tried to kind of dance around the growing tension between Unilever's broader global corporate priorities and Ben & Jerry's deep commitment to outspoken political and social activism, which sometimes clashed.
They didn't want to rock the boat.
It appears they avoided confronting the issue head-on. Instead of facing the internal friction directly, acknowledging the conflict, and maybe having the difficult, emotionally charged conversations about mission alignment and brand identity, leadership seemed to avoid the core issue, perhaps hoping it would resolve itself or just go away.
Which, of course,
it didn't. The avoidance ultimately led to a full-blown public crisis. It resulted in lawsuits, significant public confusion about the brand's identity and values, and a seriously fractured relationship between the parent company and its subsidiary.
So acknowledging the problem earlier, having those tough conversations, even though it would have been uncomfortable, that was the necessary step they avoided.
It seems that way. The cost of avoiding that short-term discomfort, that potential conflict, ended up being massive, long-term legal headaches, reputational damage, and internal turmoil. It's a classic case of avoidance backfiring.
It's still kind of baffling, though. You see these incredibly successful, intelligent leaders, people who can navigate complex, multi-billion-dollar mergers or global supply chains. Why do they suddenly become paralyzed when faced with sometimes relatively simple interpersonal conflicts or internal disagreements? What's the deep psychology driving this avoidance pattern in leaders?
Well, the psychology behind it suggests that leadership avoidance, like personal avoidance, is often fundamentally about self-protection. It might be disguised as strategic patience or waiting for more data or protecting team morale, but underneath, it frequently stems from the leader's own unprocessed emotional landscape.
Unspoken fears, old wounds.
Yes, things like unspoken fears of failure or conflict or judgment. Unconscious scripting from past experiences where confrontation went badly, or, and this is really crucial in organizational change, unprocessed grief. Leaders don't just avoid external conflict. They often avoid the internal emotional experience that the conflict triggers or represents for them.
That's interesting. We normally reserve the word grief for, bereavement, losing a loved one. How does grief apply in a business or leadership context?
It applies quite powerfully, actually. In a business setting, grief can stem from many kinds of perceived losses. It could be the failure of a pet project or a major strategic initiative. It could be the loss of market share or the loss of certainty in a rapidly changing industry. It might be the painful disillusionment that comes from realizing a company culture they helped build has become toxic, or even the loss of their own professional identity as their role shifts or the company restructures. These are all forms of loss that can trigger a grief response.
So if a leader is facing one of these losses, they might be cycling through something like Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining right there in their corner office.
Precisely. And if they get stuck, particularly in denial, you'll see it manifest in their leadership behavior. They might dismiss critical market data, ignore negative feedback from their team, rationalize poor results, or cling rigidly to a failing strategy long after its expiration date. They're denying the reality of the loss.
And if they don't process that grief, that denial,
it leaks out. Unresolved grief often leaks into leadership behaviors, manifesting as compulsions that offer a false sense of control amidst the emotional chaos. Things like overworking, becoming overly controlling or micromanaging, engaging in constant obsessive planning, trying to control every variable.
Trying to regain control externally because they feel out of control internally.
Exactly. These behaviors provide a temporary, illusory sense of order and control, but they don't address the underlying grief or fear. The leader often feels stuck, chronically stressed, burned out, constantly chasing a feeling of completion they can never quite reach because they're fundamentally avoiding the root emotion they need to process.
This means that avoidance isn't saving the leader time or energy. It's actually creating this enormous, often invisible price tag for the entire organization. How can we sort of quantify that cost? Where does it show up?
We can think about the expense of avoidance showing up in at least 3 key areas. First, there's a high emotional labor cost for the leader themselves. Constantly suppressing or pretending you're not feeling difficult emotions like fear, disappointment, or grief builds up crippling internal pressure. This leads directly to burnout, impairs judgment, reduces creativity, and fosters profound disengagement from their role. They're running on empty.
Okay, so it hurts the leader. How does it hurt the team?
That's the second area. Team dynamics suffer immensely. Employees, they're usually acutely tuned in to the emotional signals their leaders send out, even the nonverbal ones. They sense the avoided conflict. They notice the sugar-coated feedback that doesn't match reality. They feel the tension around the problems that are left unnamed.
And that creates confusion, mistrust.
Definitely. It leads to confusion, anxiety, and a quiet but steady erosion of trust. When employees realize their leader isn't willing or able to address reality honestly, they eventually stop bringing reality to the leader. Why bother raising a difficult issue if you know it will be ignored or deflected? So the organization loses its vital upward feedback loop. Problems go unreported until they explode.
And the third cost?
The third area is the creation of strategic blind spots. As we said, denial impairs clarity. If a leader is unconsciously avoiding the painful truth that, say, their core strategy is flawed or the market has shifted, they will selectively ignore or rationalize away the data points that confirm this failure. This leads to poor strategic decisions, wasted resources, and allows small, fixable problems to fester until they become potentially catastrophic crises.
Is there data linking this kind of healthy, emotionally aware leadership to actual business outcomes?
Yes, there is. Research consistently shows a strong correlation. For instance, some studies indicate that organizations characterized by strong, psychologically healthy, emotionally aware leadership are significantly more likely figures, like 2.3 times more likely to outperform their peers in metrics like productivity and profitability. Emotional health isn't just feel-good stuff, it's directly linked to the bottom line.
Okay, let's drill down on the ultimate failure point here. Accountability avoidance. You mentioned an anecdote about a tech CEO who couldn't handle the shame of a product failure.
Right. This is a classic, almost archetypal example of how that normative male alexithymia pattern we discussed earlier can translate directly into toxic corporate culture. In this case, you had a leader whose sense of self-worth seemed entirely wrapped up in external success and appearing infallible.
So when his major product line failed,
the internal emotional experience, likely intense shame, maybe fear, deep disappointment, was simply too painful, too threatening, too vulnerable for him to process or acknowledge, even to himself. He couldn't integrate the reality, I was wrong, or I made a mistake, or I failed.
So rather than owning it, learning from it, he externalized the pain.
Exactly. Instead of offering a genuine apology, taking ownership and leading a post-mortem to learn from the failure, he immediately jumped into denial and displacement. He publicly blamed the marketing team for poor messaging. He privately criticized the engineers for inadequate execution. He shifted the blame entirely onto others.
He willfully designed his own emotional reality of failure and shame.
Yes. And in doing so, he didn't just protect his fragile ego, he actively fostered a toxic culture. What do you think the employees learned from watching that?
They learned the new company motto very quickly: never take ownership, never admit a mistake, because the penalty for showing vulnerability or admitting failure is being scapegoated by the person at the top.
Precisely. The entire system begins to rot from the head down when accountability is consistently evaded. Real leadership requires profound honesty, and that honesty has to start with self-reflection and owning one's own emotional reality, failures included.
So breaking this destructive cycle of avoidance and denial, both personally and organizationally, it requires building something fundamentally different from that engineer's brittle stoicism. It requires real emotional resilience.
It absolutely does. And building that resilience starts with awareness. It means leaders, and really all of us, need to start recognizing our own personal avoidance cues. What are the little habits we fall into when we feel uncomfortable or threatened?
Like what? Procrastinating on difficult conversations.
Yeah. Delaying crucial meetings, or writing overly vague emails when directness is needed, sugarcoating feedback until it's meaningless, or maybe becoming completely consumed by low-stakes administrative tasks, or endless research as a way to avoid tackling the core issue. These are all clues that fear or discomfort might be driving the bus.
So notice the cues and then...
And then crucially, learn to call the underlying fear or discomfort what it is, without judgment. Acknowledge it. Okay, I'm feeling anxious about this conversation, or I'm feeling disappointed by this result. Building emotional resilience isn't about not feeling these things. It's about building a greater tolerance for experiencing these hard emotions: grief, disappointment, shame, fear, uncertainty.
So the goal isn't to eliminate the discomfort, it's actually to learn to lead through it, to increase your capacity to hold it.
Exactly. To learn to stand still in the discomfort, metaphorically speaking, to breathe through it, to accept its presence without immediately needing to run from it, fix it instantly, or displace it onto someone else. That is the emerging 21st century definition of leadership strength.
It's a very different definition from the old code.
Completely different. The old male code, the suppression, the denial, the stoic facade we discussed in the first segment, maybe it served some evolutionary purpose eons ago. Perhaps cultivating a certain callousness was adaptive for denying physical pain or facing immediate physical threats. Who knows? But the challenges we face today, personally and collectively, are vastly different. They require an updated code.
And that updated code values emotional awareness, connection.
Yes. The strength required now, the strength that actually leads to better outcomes in relationships and organizations, is emotional awareness, the capacity for genuine connection, and the courage to show up authentically, imperfections and all.
So just to recap, we've really traced a clear line today, haven't we? From that individual tendency towards emotional suppression, often learned through things like normative male alexithymia, through to the relational consequences, like the outsourcing of emotional intelligence onto partners, leading to dynamics like relational management.
Yeah, the burden it creates.
And finally, scaling up to the systemic failures we see in leadership and organizations when accountability and emotional honesty are avoided. It really feels like a unified crisis stemming from the same root denial.
I think it is. It's all interconnected. But the hopeful sign is that we are seeing cultural shifts that recognize this.
Yeah.
You see the significant growth, for instance, in organizations, podcasts, books, therapy modalities, all dedicated specifically to helping men reconnect with their emotions, find healthier forms of connection with themselves and other men. It proves there's a growing awareness and a hunger for change. There's no inherent contradiction between masculinity and having a full, rich, authentic emotional life. That's a false dichotomy we need to leave behind.
It really brings us back to that opening demand, teach me then. In the end, the kind of cold, hard logic demanded by self-proclaimed rationalists often seems like just a sophisticated, intellectual-sounding excuse. An excuse to evade the one responsibility that ultimately cannot be delegated or outsourced.
Which is
Owning one's own full humanness. Maybe the most profound act of courage isn't stoicism, isn't building that fortress. Maybe it's simply the willingness to sit quietly with one's own discomfort, to acknowledge the fear or the sadness or the shame, and to claim the full, messy, complex reality of one's own emotional experience.